It was a time when the streets of Los Angeles were buzzing with the energy of the early 1990s, a decade defined by grit style and the rise of a new kind of action hero. The sun seemed to shine brighter on the Pacific Coast and the dreams of millions were being woven into the fabric of Hollywood. But amidst the glitz and the glamour there was one actor who moved through the world with a quiet grace that set him apart from the rest. Keanu Reeves was not just another face on the big screen, he was a man who carried himself with a sense of mystery and a humility that was rare in a town built on ego and excess. He had found himself standing on the precipice of superstardom, with movies like Point Break already making waves and the massive hit Speed just on the horizon. The world was watching him, waiting to see how high he would soar. But Keanu was not looking down from a penthouse window, he was looking out from the driver's seat of a car that meant more to him than any award or statue ever could. While his peers were filling their driveways with Ferraris and Lamborghinis and hiring chauffeurs to drive them to premieres, Keanu had fallen in love with a machine that had a soul of its own. It was a vintage 1973 Porsche 911, a dark green beauty that roared with a sound unlike anything on the road today. This car was not just a status symbol to him, it was a companion, a piece of art that he could control with his own hands. He loved the smell of the engine oil and the feel of the steering wheel, and the way the car hugged the road when he took a tight corner. It was his escape pod, a place where he could just be Keanu, away from the cameras and the screaming fans and the endless questions about his next project. The car had character, it had history, and it had a few scratches and dents that proved it was lived in and loved just like the man who drove it. Every morning he would slide into the driver's seat, grip the stick shift, and feel the connection between man and machine. It was a ritual that grounded him, reminding him of the simple joys of life before the world got too complicated. But on this particular day the air felt different. There was a sense of anticipation, a need to make the driving experience even better. Keanu had decided that the sound system in his beloved Porsche was not doing justice to the music he loved. He wanted to hear the engine purr in harmony with his favorite tracks, so he made a decision that would change everything. He drove the car not to a high-end boutique in Beverly Hills, but to a rougher part of town, a place known for its mechanics who knew cars from the inside out, not just the shiny exterior. He parked the dark green Porsche in front of a small stereo installation shop in South Central Los Angeles. The neighborhood was gritty, the buildings were covered in graffiti, and the heat radiating off the asphalt was oppressive. But Keanu did not see the danger or the risk, he only saw a solution to his problem. He walked into the shop with his hands in his pockets and a friendly smile on his face, ignoring the strange looks he got from the people hanging around the street corner. He did not act like a star, he acted like a regular guy who wanted his car fixed. He spoke to the mechanics with respect, treating them as equals, explaining exactly what he wanted done to the sound system. He handed over the keys to the 1973 Porsche without a second thought, trusting that the job would be done right. The mechanics were surprised to see such a famous actor standing in their shop, and even more surprised by his car. They promised him they would take care of it and told him to come back in a few hours. Keanu nodded, thanked them, and walked out of the shop, leaving his treasure behind. As he walked away he did not look back. He might have hailed a cab or caught a ride with a friend, his mind already drifting to the lines he had to memorize for his next film or the band he was practicing with. He had no reason to suspect that this simple errand would turn into a nightmare. He had no way of knowing that there were eyes watching him from the shadows, people who saw the car not as a work of art but as a payday. The streets of Los Angeles can be unforgiving, and trust is a luxury that not everyone can afford. As the hours ticked by, the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. While Keanu went about his day thinking about his music and his car, the wheels of fate were already turning in that dusty shop. The Porsche sat silent and waiting, a gem hidden in plain sight, and the thieves were already plotting their move. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and trouble, and the stage was set for a drama that would leave even the seasoned police officers speechless in the days to come. It was a moment of calm before the storm, a pause in the life of a man who valued his privacy above all else. Little did he know that his sanctuary was about to be violated, and the simple act of upgrading a stereo would turn into a battle For justice and a test of his famous patience, the city hummed around him, indifferent to his struggles, but the story of the green Porsche was far from over. It was just beginning to unfold in a way that no one could have predicted, not even the most seasoned screenwriters in Hollywood. The sun began its slow descent behind the tall buildings of Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the concrete streets as the afternoon wore on. The city started to shift from the busy workday to the unpredictable energy of the evening, and for Keanu Reeves it was time to go back to the shop. He had spent the last few hours doing what he usually did, running lines, keeping to himself, or perhaps just enjoying a quiet moment of peace away from the noise of the movie sets. He trusted that his dark green Porsche was in good hands, and the thought of driving it home with a brand new sound system brought a genuine smile to his face. He could almost hear the music pumping, feel the bass vibrating through the seats, and see the open road stretching out in front of him. It was the simple things that made him happy, and this car was one of the best simple things he had ever found. He did not drive a flashy limousine to the shop, he just made his way there like a normal person ready to pick up his property. When he arrived at the location, the streets were getting a bit darker and the vibe of the neighborhood felt a little heavier than it had earlier in the day, but he did not pay much attention to that. His focus was entirely on the small parking lot outside the stereo installation shop. He expected to see the familiar curve of the Porsche waiting for him, but as he walked closer to the spot where he had left it, his steps began to slow down. A strange feeling washed over him, a cold knot forming in the pit of his stomach. The space was empty. It was not just that the car was gone, it was that the space was completely vacant, as if nothing had ever been there. He looked left, he looked right, he scanned the street thinking maybe they had moved it, maybe they parked it around the back to make room for another customer, but there was no sign of the dark green vehicle anywhere. He stood there for a moment, blinking, trying to make sense of what his eyes were telling him. It was impossible that someone would just move a classic car without telling the owner, but the reality was staring him right in the face. The car was not where it was supposed to be. With a heavy feeling in his chest, he walked into the small shop. The bell above the door jingled, but the sound did not bring him any comfort. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and old electronics, and a few of the workers were starting to clean up their tools, getting ready to close down for the night. Keanu looked at them, his expression calm but his eyes searching for answers. He asked about his car simply and directly. Where was the Porsche? The mechanics looked at him and then at each other. There was a moment of hesitation, a flash of confusion, and then a look of genuine alarm on their faces. They asked him what he meant. They said that the car was supposed to be right outside. They said that they had not moved it. They said that they had not driven it anywhere. One of the workers rushed to the back door to check the alleyway while another ran outside to scan the street again, but it was no use. The car was gone. It had vanished into the thin air of the city. The realization hit the room like a ton of bricks. The car had been stolen right from under their noses. And Keanu stood there listening to the panic in their voices, watching them scramble to find an explanation that did not exist. He did not yell, he did not scream, he did not throw a fit or act like a movie star demanding justice right that second. Instead, he felt a deep sense of disappointment, a quiet sadness that settled in his bones. It was not about the money, it was never about the money, it was about the trust he had placed in these people and the connection he had with that machine. It was the violation of something personal that hurt the most. He walked outside with the shop owner and the mechanics, who were now looking terrified. They knew they were in trouble. They knew that a celebrity had left his car in their care and now it was gone. The police were called, and as they waited for the sirens to approach, Keanu looked down the empty street. The city lights were flickering on in the distance and the sounds of traffic were humming in the background, but to him it all felt a bit muted. The thrill of the day had turned into a heavy burden. When the police officers finally arrived, they saw the famous actor standing there calmly, but they could see the weight on his shoulders. They took down the details: the make, the model, the year, the color, and the license plate number. They asked him what was inside the car, if there were any valuables, if he had the keys, and Keanu answered every question with patience and precision. He told them about the custom work he had done over the years. He told them about the scratch on the bumper and the way the engine started on the first try. He described the car with such love and detail that even the hardened officers stopped to listen. They could see that this was not just a stolen auto. Report to him, it was a missing friend. The police officers began their investigation, talking to witnesses, looking for tire marks, checking with nearby businesses, but the thief was long gone. They had disappeared into the vastness of Los Angeles with a piece of Keanu's Heart. And as the officers finished writing up their report and drove away into the night, Keanu was left standing there without his ride. He had to find another way home, a ride that felt empty and quiet compared to the roar of the Porsche engine. He got into a borrowed car or maybe a taxi and stared out the window as the city lights blurred past him. He thought about the unfairness of it all, about how hard it is to hold on to things you love in a world that is always trying to take them away. He wondered where the car was right now, who was driving it, and if they were treating it with the same care he always did. He knew the chances of getting it back were slim, especially in a city where cars disappeared every day and were never seen again, or worse, were stripped down and sold for parts. The thought made him shudder, but he tried to stay positive. He tried to remind himself that it was just a machine made of metal and rubber and glass, but it did not help the sinking feeling in his chest. He arrived at his home later that night, walking into a quiet house that felt even emptier without the prospect of the Porsche sitting in the garage. He knew that tomorrow he would have to wake up and go to work and pretend like everything was fine. He would have to smile for the cameras and say his lines and be the action hero everyone expected him to be, but inside he would be thinking about that empty parking lot and the dark green car that was nowhere to be found. It was a hard lesson learned about trust and the harsh reality of the city he lived in, a lesson that cost him something truly valuable. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, he could not shake the image of the vacant spot where his dream machine used to be, the silence of the room echoing the silence of the streets where his car had been taken. Days began to melt together into a long blur of disappointment and silence for Keanu. The first 24 hours had passed with a frantic kind of hope, where he kept checking his phone and looking out the window, expecting to see the dark green Porsche cruising down the street. But by the second and third day, that hope had started to fade into a heavy dull ache. He knew the statistics of Los Angeles. He knew that cars disappeared every hour of every day, and most of them never came back whole. It was a city that devoured things and moved on without a second glance. But this was not just any car, and this was not just any owner. Even though he was busy filming and had to keep up with the intense schedule of an action movie, his mind kept drifting back to that empty parking lot. He would find himself staring at the stand-in cars provided by the movie studio, feeling a disconnect because the steering wheel did not feel the same and the engine did not have the same soul. It was like wearing someone else's shoes. They fit, but they were not yours, and they did not take you where you wanted to go with the same comfort. Meanwhile, across town, the police investigation was moving at a frustratingly slow pace. The officers assigned to the case were good men who wanted to help, but they were swamped with robberies, assaults and homicides in a city that never slept. The file on Keanu Reeves' stolen Porsche sat on a desk among hundreds of other files, gathering a thin layer of dust. The detective in charge of the case would look at the photos of the actor and the vintage car and feel a renewed sense of duty, knowing that this was not just a common theft but a violation of a man who seemed to genuinely deserve a break. They put out an alert to all patrol units to keep an eye out for the vehicle. They circulated the description to local chop shops and tow yards, hoping that someone might have seen something or heard something on the street. But the criminal underground in Los Angeles is a tight-knit and silent world, and nobody was talking. It was as if the Porsche had simply vanished from the face of the earth, leaving no tire tracks and no witnesses. As the week dragged on, the pressure began to mount. The media had caught wind of the story, and while Keanu did not make a public scene, the press loved a good celebrity mystery, especially one involving a beloved star and a classic car. Rumors swirled around Hollywood about where the car might be and who took it, but none of the rumors brought the car back. Every morning that passed made it less likely that the engine would still be intact or that the interior would be unharmed. Thieves were usually not gentle with their prizes. They drove them hard, stripped them down and sold the parts for quick cash, leaving the husk behind to rot in some forgotten corner of the city. Keanu tried to accept this reality. He told himself that it was just material things, that he should be grateful for his health and his career, and he truly believed that. But there was a part of him that felt a quiet anger. It was not the kind of anger that makes you shout. It was the kind that simmers deep inside, a frustration with the unfairness of the world and the people who Think they can take what is not theirs. On the ninth day after the theft, the weather in Los Angeles turned hot and dry with a wind that blew dust across the freeways and dried out the lawns. It was the kind of day that made people irritable and tired. The detectives were buried under paperwork when the phone rang on the desk. It was a routine call from a resident who lived in a quiet industrial area on the outskirts of the city. The resident sounded hesitant on the phone, explaining that they were walking their dog near an old alleyway behind some warehouses when they saw a car that looked out of place. It was covered in dust and looked like it had been sitting there for a while, but it did not look like the usual abandoned junk cars they saw in that area. It looked expensive, or at least it used to be. The detective listened closely, making notes. The description matched the 1973 Porsche 911, the dark green color, the vintage shape. It was a thin lead, but it was the only one they had had in days. The detective wasted no time grabbing the keys to the squad car and calling a partner to ride along. The drive to the location felt long and tense. The landscape of the city changed from the glamorous billboards to the gritty industrial zones where the buildings were made of concrete and corrugated metal and the sidewalks were empty. The sun was beating down on the windshield, making the inside of the police car uncomfortably warm as they turned onto the street where the witness had reported seeing the vehicle. The officers scanned the area carefully. It was a desolate place with weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement and the smell of oil and garbage heavy in the air. They slowed down, driving past piles of wooden pallets and chain link fences with barbed wire on top. The detective felt a mix of skepticism and hope. He had been on enough of these calls to know that witnesses often mistake cars for one another, and it could turn out to be a similar looking Volkswagen or just a green junker with no value. But as they approached the alleyway, the dark silhouette of a car emerged from the shadows. It was sitting alone between two large dumpsters, looking small and vulnerable. The officers parked the car and stepped out into the heat, their hands resting near their belts. Out of habit, they walked slowly toward the vehicle, checking the surroundings to make sure no one was lurking in the shadows. As they got closer, the details of the car became clearer. The shape of the headlights, the curve of the fender, the faded paint. It was definitely the Porsche they were looking for. The detective felt a surge of adrenaline run through his veins. They had found it against all odds. They had found the needle in the haystack. He radioed in the update to the precinct, letting them know that the stolen vehicle had been located standing there in that quiet, dirty alleyway. The detective felt a sense of relief, knowing that he could finally deliver some good news to the actor who had lost so much more than just a car. But as they stood there looking at the vehicle, a strange feeling came over them. Something did not look right. The way the car was sitting there was unsettling. It was too low to the ground and the silence around it felt heavy. The doors were closed and the windows were dusty, but there was a vibe coming off the car that made the officers pause before touching it. It was the calm before the realization, the moment before the truth of what had really happened to Keanu Reeves' dream machine would be revealed. The air was still and the dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that broke through the gaps in the warehouse roofs. The car was back, but the mystery of where it had been and what it had gone through during those 9 missing days was only just beginning to unravel. 2 officers stood in the dusty alleyway looking at the dark green Porsche. The heat of the midday sun beat down on their shoulders, but neither of them moved. They were staring at the car, trying to process what they were seeing. It was clear that this was the missing vehicle they had been searching for. The shape was unmistakable. It was the classic silhouette of a 1973 Porsche 911, the car that Keanu Reeves had reported stolen 9 days ago. But something felt wrong about the way it was sitting there. The car looked lower to the ground than it should have, as if it had lost its will to stand tall. The detective stepped forward, moving slowly around the vehicle, his boots crunching on the dry gravel and broken glass that littered the pavement. He reached out to touch the hood, but his hand stopped in mid-air. The metal felt cold even in the heat. A shiver went down his spine as he looked closer at the gaps in the body panels. This was not just a car that had been driven hard and parked. This was a car that had been violated in the worst way possible. He walked over to the driver's side door and pulled on the handle. It was unlocked, which was the first sign that the car was truly abandoned. The door creaked open with a sad groan, revealing a darkness inside that seemed to swallow the light. The detective leaned in and his breath caught in his throat. The interior was gone, not just messy or thrown about, but completely gone. The seats were missing, the dashboard was torn out, leaving only a skeleton of wires and metal framing hanging loosely like the veins of a dying creature. The expensive stereo system that Keanu had come to install that very day was of course nowhere to be seen, but the thieves had not stopped there. They had taken everything that was not bolted down, and even things that were. The steering column was broken, leaving the steering wheel limp and useless. The detective stepped back and looked at his partner, his face pale and serious. They both knew that the damage on the outside would be even worse. They moved to the front of the car and the detective used a gloved hand to release the hood latch. It popped open with a metallic click, but when he tried to lift the hood it felt light, too light. He raised it up and stared into the empty engine bay, his eyes wide in shock. It was a cavernous hole where the heart of the car used to be. The engine was gone, the transmission was gone, the car was just a shell, a hollow body stripped of its soul. It was a surgical operation performed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. They had dismantled the machine piece by piece, taking the most valuable parts to sell on the black market, leaving behind a carcass that was worthless to anyone but the owner who loved it. The silence of the alley was deafening as the officers stood there processing the brutal reality of the scene. They had seen stolen cars before, they had seen stripped cars before, but there was something deeply personal about seeing a beloved classic treated with such disregard. It felt like walking into a home that had been ransacked, seeing the life sucked out of a place that used to be full of warmth and memories. The officer walked around to the back of the car and checked the trunk area, hoping that maybe something was left, but it was the same story, empty except for some dirt and rust. The thieves had been thorough. They had taken the lights, the bumpers, the glass, everything that had value was gone. They had turned a work of art into a pile of junk. The wind blew a tumbleweed across the alley, bouncing off the side of the ruined Porsche with a hollow thud. It was a sound that seemed to mock the tragedy of the situation. The detective took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead, feeling a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. He knew that he would have to call Keanu Reeves. He would have to tell the actor that they found his car, but the news would not be good. It would be devastating to hear that the machine he loved so much, the one he treated with such care, had been destroyed so ruthlessly. The thought of making that call made the detective feel sick to his stomach. He looked at the empty space where the engine used to be and imagined the sound it used to make, the roar that Keanu loved so much. That sound was gone now, silenced by greed and carelessness. The officers began to take photographs of the scene, documenting every angle, every stolen part, every scratch on the body. The flash of the camera went off like tiny explosions in the quiet alley, illuminating the sadness of the stripped vehicle. They knew that this case was not just about retrieving stolen property, it was about the loss of something that could never be replaced. Even if Keanu bought another Porsche, it would not be this one. It would not have the same history or the same scratches or the same memories. This car was unique, and now it was broken beyond repair. The realization hit the officers hard, leaving them truly speechless as they stood guard over the empty shell of what used to be a dream machine. The city of Los Angeles continued to bustle. In the distance, sirens wailed and people hurried about their lives, unaware that in this small forgotten alleyway a small tragedy had occurred. A piece of automotive history had died, and a good man had lost a friend. The detective closed his notebook and looked one last time at the green paint that was now faded and dull. He whispered a quiet apology to the car and to the man who owned it, feeling a deep sense of sorrow in the pit of his stomach. It was a grim discovery that would stay with him for a long time, a reminder of how quickly beautiful things can be destroyed by the harsh realities of the world. The detective stood by his patrol car, holding the phone in his hand with a heavy feeling in his gut. He knew that making this call was part of the job, but that did not make it any easier. He had to deliver the news to Keanu Reeves, the news that they had found the car, but it was not the happy reunion that anyone had hoped for. The line rang a few times before a calm voice answered on the other end. The detective took a deep breath and explained the situation. He told Keanu that the Porsche had been located in an alleyway on the outskirts of the city. He hesitated for a moment, trying to find the right words to describe the condition of the vehicle without being too harsh, but there was no gentle way to say it. He told the actor that the car had been stripped down to nothing, that it was just a shell of its former self. On the other end of the line there was a long silence. The detective braced himself for an outburst or a string of angry words. He had dealt with many celebrities in the past, and he knew that money and fame sometimes made people feel entitled to yell at police officers when things went wrong, but the voice that came back was soft and quiet. Keanu simply asked where the car was and said that he would come right away. The detective was surprised by the lack of emotion in the actor's voice, but he assumed the shock would set in later when Keanu saw the wreckage with his own eyes. A short while later, a plain black car pulled up to the entrance of the alleyway. Keanu stepped out looking tired but composed. He was dressed in simple clothes, a t-shirt and jeans, with his hair pushed back messily. He did not have an entourage with him, no bodyguards, no publicists, no lawyers, just him alone, ready to face the reality of what had happened to his beloved machine. He walked towards the officers with his hands in his pockets, nodding a greeting to the men who had worked on the case. The detective stepped forward and gestured towards the dark green shell sitting in the shadows. He warned Keanu again that it was not a pretty sight that the thieves had taken everything they could. Keanu just nodded and kept walking, his eyes fixed on the car. As he got closer, the reality of the theft became undeniable. The Porsche sat there looking like a skeleton stripped of its flesh. The paint was dull, the interior was gutted, and the engine bay was a gaping hole. Keanu stopped a few feet away and stood there in silence. He did not kick the tires, he did not shout or curse, he did not even cry. He just looked at it with a sense of quiet acceptance. The officers watched him closely, waiting for some sign of rage or sorrow, but what they saw left them more speechless than the condition of the car itself. Keanu walked around the shell slowly, running his hand over the dusty metal. He touched the places where parts used to be, as if saying a final goodbye to an old friend. There was a look of peace on his face that the detectives could not understand. It was as if he had already processed the anger and the sadness and had arrived at a place of understanding. He turned to the officers and thanked them for finding it. He told them that he knew how busy they were and that he appreciated their hard work. The detective was stunned. He had never seen anyone react to such a violation with so much grace. Most people would be screaming about insurance or demanding a manhunt, but Keanu was just standing there, grateful that they had found the shell at all. Keanu explained to them that it was just a car after all. He said that metal and rubber could be replaced, but people could not. He told them that he was just glad that no one got hurt over it, that the theft was just a thing and things do not last forever. His voice was sincere and his eyes were clear, showing a depth of character that is rarely seen in the spotlight of Hollywood. The officers felt a newfound respect for the man standing before them. They realized that the rumors about him were true. He really was different. He really did care about the simple things, and he really did not let the material world rule his emotions. The car was towed away, eventually taken to a lot where it would be processed for insurance and likely scrapped because the damage was too severe to repair. Keanu watched it go one last time before getting back into his own car and driving away. He did not look back with regret. He looked forward, knowing that life would go on. The news of the discovery spread quickly through the media, and the public was shocked not just by the brutality of the theft but by the actor's reaction. Headlines talked about how he kept his cool and how he showed gratitude instead of anger. It became a story that wasn't about a stolen car but about the man who lost it. The green Porsche was gone, but the legend of Keanu Reeves' kindness grew even stronger. In the wake of the loss, people saw that you could be a movie star and still be a human being, that you could lose something you love and still treat others with respect. The officers who worked the case never forgot that day in the alleyway. It reminded them that there is more to people than the characters they play on screen, and that true strength is not about shouting the loudest but about staying calm when the world tries to break you. Keanu eventually moved on. He bought other cars and continued to drive through the city he loved, but the memory of the dark green 911 stayed with him as a reminder of the impermanence of things and the importance of holding on to what really matters, like your dignity and your peace of mind. The story of the car that was stripped bare ended up revealing the full heart of the man who owned it, proving that even when you have nothing left, you still have the choice of how you will stand tall.